hallowed halls of this wonderful mausoleum with a show that's going to take us all the way back to about the 1400s. So if you could all find your seats and get comfortable. I've got a very hard deadline of 3:30 today, which, if anyone's known me and my history, is a very difficult thing to do, because I do have a gift of the gab, so I can talk underwater, which I'm quite proud of, which is fine. This is an honour today. It's always an honour to present here. I do have a special affinity with the historic Oakwood cemetery and this particular mausoleum. It's one of the rare treats where I actually get to talk in a place like this where so many people have come before us. And for some of these people who perhaps are in the audience, and these people are your families, it's actually even more precious to me because you get to spend some time with your family members. So I don't take that lightly, I take that very, very seriously and honestly. So thank you very much for having me here for the return. It's something I wanted to take into account where I've called this one Profit and Loss. And wherever there's grief, wherever there are people suffering, wherever there are people who are dying, and remember, it's the one thing, it's inevitable. We can't get away from it. There is someone there to make money from it, unfortunately. So, in my research and my long time now of focusing my life to this particular focus of jewellery and art, I wanted to go back and actually figure out who these people were. And I don't think it removes itself from the romanticism that goes into these jewels at all. That it actually amplifies the fact that there is one side where people are grieving, but there is another side where people are actually profiting from this loss. So who were these people? How much money did they make? And how did they actually satisfy and sustain their families and businesses during the 18th and 19th centuries? And we're going to look at that for the second half of the talk. But up front, and this is a lot to digest, I'm sure, which I'll try to talk fast. Excuse the Australian accent. But I want to talk a bit about symbolism around us, the early memento mori symbols, neoclassical symbols, so the 1760 to 1820 period, and just how the allegory changed out the death symbols that were there previously. 19th century colour and nature theory, and then we'll be looking at a bit about the darkness of the 19th century, which I like to refer back to a French advertisement for a hair artist named Mourning. And they said that the British did nothing but create mortuary tablets. You were basically a walking mortuary tablet in your jewellery, whereas the French were all about creating beautiful jewels of floral and embellishment, whereas the British looked very stark in their dark black jewels they wore. But it's true, those jewels were very dark, and it was because the fact that they were so non-changing throughout the second half of the 19th century that things changed as well and the industry fell away. And then we'll skip through a bit and we'll get to profit and loss. Up front, I'd like to thank the historic Oakwood Cemetery for hosting me the second time. It means so much to me, and everyone who's put in so much effort into this particular talk, which is not an easy thing to achieve, especially when I've come all the way from Australia to do this, and Australia now is having its issues, which is hard to get away from, but to come here is just one of those special moments that I really do treasure. So hopefully I'll come back again. If for those of you who don't know me, I am the Art of Mourning, which I've been running now since 2005. So I've been teaching this subject for 15 years. I'm affiliated with the British Museum, and I've used my website as a way of reaching as many people with as much education as I can possibly give. Because the more people learn, the more it dispels the mystique and the fear and the unknown about these jewels, and they are very important. I'm also on all of the things at Art of Mourning, so Patreon, Instagram, Twitter. Please reach out to me at any time if you haven't already. And I try to get back to everyone as quickly as I possibly can. I've been around, I've been on television. There's a very young me. I've done museum installations. I've done workshops. I had a book that has recently come out. And there's me with Lady Caroline Percy in Syon Park earlier this year. And she's the Duke of Northumberland's sister, and I did a full day show there, going through all of the different fashion and the reasons why people wore the fashion and the jewels in the particular house of Syon. It's a beautiful thing. Now, for those of you who may follow me, I've had a book chapter come out a bit earlier this year, based on the second half of today's talk, called Profit and Loss. and it's a Miscellany of Death and Folly, so you can still get this. It's only limited to 300 copies, unfortunately, but if you read my 10,000 words here, we're actually going to get the second half of today's talk amplified. Now, symbolism around us. This is pretty much where I live in Australia, right here. And every day I wake up to these symbols, the urn. And if you've walked around the cemetery, you've seen these symbols everywhere around you. We start to see the acanthus and roses and all of these other symbols which we take for granted because they're there. Yet these symbols are still created today. And I'm sure that if you've walked around town, you've seen these symbols in action all the way around you. Here we have Corinthian columns. Yet what we see when we walk around is this. We see the shops, the advertising, we see the products that are being promoted, we see the cafe, the restaurants, but we don't look up. And if you look up, like I like to do when I walk around Melbourne, Australia, is get transported about 200 years ago. And you can do that just walking around your very town. And I think people take that for granted. They don't know that all of those symbols are actually just as thriving today. And why are they there? Why did people design these in architecture and art? And why were they there in jewellery? Because I've looked at these jewels for over half my life now, and they're still a mystery sometimes. Yet we're here to understand what these symbols could possibly mean and why they were used. So, symbolism is so very important because it identifies us with other cultures, our friends, our family, our religion, and has done so since we created civilization in the Tigris and the Euphrates, all those many thousands of years ago. Yet in the early modern period, for mourning jewellery, we identified with something like this. And this being the primary symbol is probably one of the hardest to remove yourself from, because you see it when you look at your friends and your family, you see it during times of high attrition when people are passing away, in times of war, times of famine, times of sickness, and this is essentially what we all will become, and we can't remove ourselves from that, unfortunately. So, as a symbol, it was used in jewellery quite frequently to show immortality, and it developed over time. It's still used today, for different purposes and different reasons, but it's still used today. We still identify with it because it represents us, and we can't remove ourselves from mortality. But then we see things like this, a symbol of religion, and a lot of this talk is based around my background, so a very British background, but remember, we're all a colony here at the end of the day. Sorry, I can't help myself. It's the joy of being Australian. But we still identify with the same symbols, and this particular symbol here, regardless of when religion did split at a certain time, in about 1517, October 31st to be exact, we still identify with it, but also with things like that. Which, if you're a jewellery collector, you might look at that and say, well, it's the Maltese cross. Sure, but also it's adaptation by other cultures, and it still goes back to Christianity, so it still has its Christian fundamental. It's actually the cross puté, or the cross forme, and it's been used for different reasons. It's been used by secular knights, and of course used in Malta, but also it goes back to its Christian value. So it still has its representation, and we'll see that especially for those of you who have travelled outside of there and looked around at all of the other places where, say, different Christian sects were buried. We have different variations of the cross, but it's still an identifier as a symbol. And over time we have things like our angels, and the angels developed and they started to change and morph, and they were used, but also blended over the early modern period with things like this, with our cherub, with our representation of Eros. The cherub still represents that angelic proximity and closeness to love and closeness to religion, and you'll see this in the jewellery with our cherubs, or our puté, blowing horns and trumpets and announcing a soul into the heavens, but also shooting an arrow into the heart of a lover. So we have our Cupid connotation. But people like Donatello were very influenced by, say, old sarcophagi and archaeological digs. So he would actually design a lot of classical art into what was being paid for by Catholics. So he fudged it a bit, and you'll find his putte inside his artwork. However, if someone who was his boss, who was commissioning the work, came along and asked, it's an angel. Funny that. The great thing about these symbols is they've never gone away. They've adapted over time, and their meaning adapts. So what we need to do when we look at symbols, especially in the jewellery, is understand why it adapted and who was looking at it at that time. Because the worst thing you can do is apply your modernity into these jewels. And think about that, because we are an educated society with all of these symbolic meanings at our fingertips, but at the time when education wasn't there, when archaeology wasn't discovered, when things like languages are controlled by governments and religious power, they weren't walking encyclopedias for these things. They had to look at them through their own lens. And that's what you need to do when you see a piece that's from about 1680 with one of these in it. They didn't have the classical knowledge we did. I mentioned our trumpet, our heraldry, our symbolizing, say, victory, and announcing a soul into the heavens. But as time went on, we've got one of my favourite symbols. I've got one in each hand, our urn and our vessel. You can date these right back to about 950 BCE, a vessel, to hold, especially the ones that we see interpreted here are mostly Greco-Roman, but other cultures around the Mediterranean use them as well. They were used for trade, they were vessels. It's still a vessel at the end of the day, but it's also the remains of someone, and cremation rings. Or, I'm sure if we've looked out the window, we might be able to see one of these. Our weeping willow. And the great thing for someone like me who teaches this particular subject is that it's called a weeping willow, so, I don't have to stretch imagination too far. But it's weeping, it's constantly hanging down, and it represents our sadness. Yeah, we also have our cypress. And there aren't many cemeteries I've seen that don't have a cypress. They're a hearty thing, they grow well, and they constantly point up towards the heavens. So it symbolises our hope and our soul arriving into the heavens. And we have our connection back to neoclassicism in a very strong way. You'll see these all over your buildings. Walk down the street later on after the talk, and we have our Doric, Ionic, Corinthian columns. Ionic, Corinthian, there we go. And yet, when you see these, it represents eternity, strength, undying love. It's all there, but sometimes that happens as well. And we have a life cut short. And you will see this all the way around there. But of course, this is mourning and sentimental, by the way. I do not believe in a dogmatic understanding that it's death, death, death. Remember, someone who wore something like this was both living and dead. Fidelity, piety, fidus, loyalty, the ability to always remain true to your lover, to remain by their side. And these were used in symbolism on both death and jewels that were for the living. So we can't always lock it down and say it's just for one specific thing. Even the urn itself, the urn was pop culture back in the 1780s. People actually wore urns that weren't for the sake of death, they were just popular. We need to know the context, so research is the key. We might see these particular things. Now you see these, especially those of you who have worked in the Navy perhaps, or down near the docks. But it's also one of the most prominent symbols of the turn of the 19th century, because we had this wonderful little thing that happened in about 1805 to 1815, called the Napoleonic Wars. And this is a symbol of hope. And it's pretty rare that you will find a lady not leaning next to one of these, because that's the symbol of hope. We'll see some examples a bit later on. But what happens when this happens? What do we see here? Hope. Hope. But also a cross meaning faith. Faith, hope, charity. Faith, hope and charity. Symbols start to cross-pollinate, and we start to see symbols become bigger meanings. But of course you can't have love without being anointed with a garland or a wreath. And it's got that purity, beauty, and peace element there. You might find an angel or a cherub anointing two lovebirds or a harp with one of these. Very typical during the 1760s to 1820 period. Here we have the Order of the Garter. The Garter, right there. Now that's its history. It was founded in 1348 and exclusively for the Prince of Wales and the Inner Circle. However, if you collect 19th century jewels, you'll see there's quite a bit. Now, maybe the Order of the Garter, it's definitely a garter, but it's also a belt. Now, the garter interlocks with itself and goes round and round and round for eternity, forever. Love forever, eternity. Which is the same connotation as someone who might have seen the serpent eating its own tail in the Ouroboros. Eternity. Constantly going around in and of itself. Renewal of cycle of life, death, rebirth. It's all there. But I like to focus on this one the most because I think it is the most pure, and without this, you can't have mourning, by the way. Without love, you can't have death. You can't have a reason for memory, because at the end of the day, these jewels are built for memory. Without a mourning jewel, we can't love it. We can't understand it. There's no reason I would create something for someone I didn't love. It's arbitrary. Or perhaps we've got an arrow through the heart, representing our true love, which we would offer somebody. Now, colour theory. We'll be talking a bit about colour theory as well today. And may as well start with the ones that are most important to the world. We have red. Might be a bit familiar with it. It's actually one of the most difficult colours to dye back in Grecian times. But also it represents our danger and our passion. It's got that dangerous energy to it. There's a portrait made by Nicholas Hilliard of an unknown gentleman from about 1600, and he's got the flames of passion behind him. It's quite a gorgeous thing if you've ever seen it. If you go to artofmourning.com, I've got a bit of an article about it. His shirt open, he's holding his little pendant, he's got a pearl earring and the flames of passion in it, red. But we have white. Oh, that's pretty common. I think I've seen that around town. Innocence and virginity. And of course our blue. Red, white and blue. Can't come to America and not have a bit of fun with it. So royal blue, if anyone's heard of royal blue, that was George III actually. And the French obviously have their own royal blue as well. But George III made the title of royal blue. And he went out to clothiers and tried to find a dye that would represent him and the family the best. So it was actually a factory called Scott's Bridge and Road that created the royal blue that we sometimes see in our jewellery. And if it's used in jewellery, it's also considered that the person was as royalty, to be royalty, because you love them so much. They weren't necessarily royalty. But it's a colour that people used. Because when a king or a queen did something, society copied it very thoroughly. But we also have green. Fertility, rebirth, new life. Green got used. And our favourite one, because we know it so well, black. The absence of light, the absence of life. And if we see these jewels here, we can see them being used in every single way. This one here has our blue enamel, our white enamel, innocence and purity, to be considered like royalty. We have our skull and crossbones, our death. We have our urns up here, our vessels for life, in memory of a friend, this particular one has. We even have our tree of life here, which got used in about the 1770s quite liberally. It was very popular back then. Connects the underworld with the heavens. It's also used in the Garden of Eden. Now, let's get right into it. Memento mori, symbolism. Before I get into the jewels themselves, I need to explain to you what it was like to live in these times. Because symbolism is something we take for granted. Because there's a skull and a crossbones, it must mean death. Well, no, it didn't. It developed over time. But before the skull and the crossbones was actually identified to mean us, how did people ordain their relationships through symbolism? Well, if you can see these, it's a bit difficult. These are actually all saints. So these are called iconographic rings. And these particular saints, we've got St. Christopher, St. Catherine, St. Margaret, St. Barbara, St. John the Baptist, and St. George, the patron saint of England. Now, these are also related to another type of ring called posy rings. Now, for those of you who have not seen a posy ring, they were made in base metal and also gold, so it went for very, not completely lower classes, but the middling class. And then the upper classes, they have little sentiments written inside of them or on the outside. And they were either in Middle French, Latin, or phonetic English. So just like the way that Shakespeare was written, it was written a bit like that, right? So if not, I'll just do it out, right? So it says, to thee I choose, to thee I choose, to thee I CHUUSE. There was no dictionary written back then. So they would create little sentiments to their loved ones, which they could write in jewellery. And then the ones that had the Middle French or Latin, they would actually be exercises with your cousin or your brother, and you would go out and you would do your research and you would try and find a sentiment and offer that to your family member that you could put in a ring and they would give to their loved one. So it was actually an educational exercise for the upper classes. However, these particular rings, iconographic rings, marry the two together because as a betrothal piece, the symbol you would use for your relationship would be that of a saint. Because if you ordain your relationship to God, especially through a saint, which can offer the mystical powers of the saint, maybe you like to travel, so St. Christopher. Maybe you want protection and family and virtue and new life, so you might go for someone like St. George. You can slay the dragons. You could be the patron saint. So your relationship to God was your symbol, and your relationship to your lover was ordained through the saint. And that's pre-1517. And here's an earlier piece. So what happened was during the 1378 period to about 1417, we had the schism. And that schism was a time of instability for the Catholic Church, where there were several popes vying for power at one time. And pieces like this start to change during that time. We see Mother of God, remember me. So it's actually one of the earliest mourning rings we have. And people started to destabilise their thought about who they had to talk to when it came to talking to God. Because there are several popes. So which one's the actual pope? And why are we spending all our money to a pope that's somewhat corrupt? And yet all you want to do is talk to God. So we start to see examples of these jewels which go straight to the Mother of God. And there's an example. And we have examples from Chesterfield and Norfolk Castle. That's the actual piece. So they were made in high production, but still quite cheap for what it was. Now, during this time, it's interesting, and I like to put people in that perspective. So in the space of, say, you and your parents, you've lost your connection to God through your faith. And in 1517, we had a certain person, now 95 Theses against a wall in Wittenberg, October 31st. That's Martin Luther. So, this disputation on the power of efficiency and indulgences was a way to try and combat the corruption that was going on in the Catholic Church. So we've got the Protestant Reformation that tumbled out of that. And there were people who really took advantage of that, such as Henry VIII. And he had some issues with his wives, apparently. And essentially, his way to get around that was to make the Anglican Church, Church of England. And because of that, he was the supreme head of in 1534. And essentially, from that point, he dissolved the monasteries, the dissolution of the monasteries. So now, in the space of a lifetime, I've changed my talking to God through a pope that's changed to another pope. And now, if I'm in England, I've got to talk to the king to talk to God. Now, if someone came along in your lives and completely changed the way you represented yourself, your understanding of what your parents did, your daily life and the saints that you talked to, that you prayed to on a daily basis, and that happened in the space of your lifetime, within your lifetime, surely that would destabilise the way you behave. Maybe it would make you consider what it was to represent yourself under God. And I think that's the most affecting thing, and that's why I like to show things like this. So this is actually from the Netherlands. It's about from 1530. So we hadn't gotten to the Anglican Church yet, but the Dutch were actually pretty good at representing themselves very similar to the English. And what we've got here, we've got our deceased child, and our children, and our parents. And here we have an obelisk. And this family here we can represent through Protestantism. But what we don't see is a church. We don't see a crucifix. So we need to see that people of the upper classes started to change their life around. They had education. They had this thing called guilds, where they could start to afford their children to go in and learn new skills through education, because they had the money to. And especially the English and the Dutch, they're making a lot of money on the sea. Okay, we've got the East India Company about this time. We've got investment and banking. And we've got access to new wealth. And so these classes started to gain more finance, and they could spend it on artists who could create things like jewels. And they could wear new fashion because the artists are being paid. So I'd like to take a snapshot of life as it was. However, before we dive into the skulls and the crossbones, this particular fellow had this particular section of himself removed from this particular section of himself in 1649. This is Charles I. So he was beheaded in 1649, and then Oliver Cromwell took power, and we've got the Commonwealth of England. And that went until about 1658 when Cromwell passed away, and his son Richard took over for 1 year. And then we've got the re-establishment of Charles II. And he passed away in 1685, and after that there was James II and VII, who reigned for about 2 years, and there was this thing called the Glorious Revolution. And that took him away. Why? Because he was a Catholic sympathiser. And there was no way that we're going to dissolve the Church of England and put another Catholic on the throne. And essentially, so James Stewart went to France, and they bankrolled him to try and push through Scotland, and he was a constant nuisance until about 1740. So in the space of a very short amount of time, so we've got about 50 years of destabilisation through England. And that's great for these people, but what about the people who lived? Well, I'd like to look at the 1660s as one of those catalysts, because the jewels really took off in the 1660s. And here's why. This is 1665. This is the Great Plague of London. We lost 100,000 people at this time. You can see the bodies, the funeral processions, the trenches that they dug in the churchyards just to throw the bodies into that were diseased. So 100,000 people in a population that went from 50,000 to 200,000 just after this. So it nearly wiped out London. But in 1666, the Great Fire of London. So we lost quite a bit there. We lost 13,200 houses and 87 churches. And I like these primary sources. You can actually see just the visceral nature of it. Just like that one here. A simple woodcut. You can see how bad it was. Everything just went straight up. And this is a bit more romantic. So we've got two major catastrophes in the space of a year. And previous to this, we had a king whose head was taken away from him. And then we've got the Great Frost of London. And this one here is from about 1683. Now we've got people partying in the Great Frost. We're all having fun in the frost. However, at a place where the population is now reaching 200,000, we have death. Because, yes, these people can afford to go have fun in the snow, but what happens when you're a poor person who doesn't have heating? So mass destabilisation of the population. So in the space of 2 or 3 lifetimes, we've lost our religion, we've lost our faith in our security, we've probably lost our family members. And that's when you start to see things like that. This particular piece is a little bit earlier. So this is just after, say, the Church of England was established. And it's got a wonderful basic sentiment there. Know thyself and die to live. In basic English. So it's not spelled as correctly as we would understand. However, these particular rings, know thyself, die to live, is a statement of living. And the skull becomes a statement of self. It becomes about living a better life, and that's what Memento Mori is all about. Remember, you will die. So it's not about dead people, it's about knowing you will die. And so you'll see people of that middling class we looked at with their kids wear things like this on a daily basis, because it shows their wealth, their ability to change, and then knowing that we've just gone through all of this religious destabilisation, and this is what we're going to become. So remember, you will die. And here we can see, oh, by the way, if you're following along, I've actually popped the symbols on the side here, so you can actually match the symbols to what it is. So I've got here the entire takeover of the coffin, and would you believe that pieces like this, which were actually produced all the way around the northern European countries, were also for betrothal pieces. So you could offer this to a loved one, and it's still a sentiment of love. It's not yet death. You can see this one here. It's a bit immature. I've got a cherry nose here. It's a cute little fellow. So as a design, it still wasn't set in stone yet. This one here dates from about the same period in the 1660s as all that mass attrition. So death pieces started to become the popular thing to wear because you're faced with it when you walk down the street. Dead bodies, mass trenches and graves. And yet you know it's at the top of its echelon when you start to see pieces like this. And this one here is for Mary II. So she passed away in 1694. And we have her representation not as anything but a crown, a coronet, and the skull and crossbones. So even the Queen is going to become nothing but bones in the ground. And that's essentially where it really took over to be about death. And we start to see pieces fully take over with their skeletal bands. This one here, also about the late 18th century. You can see diamonds here. Diamonds not yet plentiful. That would be about 20 years later when they started to get imported from Brazil and started to get a bit cheaper. But death starts to take over. And so much so that even here we've got the Baroque kind of band. We see white enamel as well, virginity and purity, and there's our skull. So when you see those beautiful acanthus and designs that are opulent in Baroque pieces, they squeeze little skulls in there as well. I see it in white. And they coined the term as well, memento mori. It became a popular brand, if you will. This one here is a coffin ring. That little piece of crystal up there is actually shaped as a coffin. So memento mori was a brand, and it was a popular brand. This one here is from 1721. And you can see here how the skeleton started to become as fashionable as it could possibly be because it was perfectly designed. We start to see the rib cages, the pelvic bones, everything creates a perfect design. So if I walked through Europe or I walked through England, I would still understand what this meant on my finger. But we start to see it get taken over with different symbols as well. And here we have our hourglass. Tempus fugit, time flies. Time flies, remember you will die. But of course, this is a beautiful representation of more of a simplistic piece. We have a ribbon slide. So there are two hoops on the back. These existed, well, they were popular from about the 1650 to 1720 period. And they used to put all sorts of symbolism inside of them. And they're very small. Here we've got our two cherubs blowing the trumpets. And we have our skull and crossbones on top of our hourglass with our wings. Time flies. So announcing the soul into heaven with beautiful hair, woven hair, actually pasted back there. And it says here, mem mori, memento mori. So though we use it as a term these days, it was actually a very common term for its time. But what about loving pieces? It's hard to see, but around here is red enamel. So passion starts to overtake any other reason for its being there. It's passion because we've got our two cherubs offering each other burning hearts. So you would give that to your sweetheart or your loved one. And we've got our little sentiment down there, which is a beautiful thing. It says, mine for yours, mine for yours. They're both offering each other's hearts for each other. And once again, our two little angels, you could say, but definitely beauty, taking our soul into the heavens. So they were used for both love and death, just like this one. Come, ye blessed. With our two angels blowing trumpets, and there's death. Reading where you can also notice the hair weaving here. I just saw a piece before with the same kind of woven hair. Beautiful twist. Yeah. This is, I like to joke, this is how I feel after one of these shows. I rest. And it's lovely because it's so honest, but this particular piece at a time where the skeleton is being used so frequently, it's not conforming to any of that style. The bones are what they are, but it's laying down in repose. We've got, once again, our two little angels carrying the cipher off into heaven. through a cartouche, but I rest. And it gets used again and again and again. With our arrow about to cut a life short, we have our time flies, and that's just a basic sentiment. If you were to walk down the street back in the 1680s wearing something like that, it's completely fine. It's understood that your mourning period has begun, but also the lower classes didn't do this. This is very much relegated to the upper classes. We actually have many references. There's one from the Universal Spectator in 1731 that disapproves of the lower classes dressing like they did because it made it cheaper, let's put it that way. It sort of sullied the whole mourning that they wore, which is terrible, really. And this one is a really great example. We have pearls which were imported through Lisbon and Seville, so that's where they would have come from. We have our turquoise from the Middle East. And what we have here, we have our little Cupid about to shoot an arrow into the flaming heart on a plinth. And we have green enamel used there as well. At this time, green's green, so it hasn't got its connotation just yet. Or we have our two clasped hands with our burning heart. And this is important, as we'll get to in a minute, with neoclassicism. Two clasped hands, they still produce pieces like that today, a fade or a platinum. But of course, it always comes back to the heart. And this one here was made for Charles I to restore Charles II to the throne. And you notice the shape of the heart? It's beautiful, it's perfect. We've got a shape that we understand today. And there's the reverse of it, the arrows through the heart. Now, let's have a quick look at neoclassical symbols. We've got a bit of a breakdown here of the different symbols, the different mourning periods. So this is from the 1765 period, and this is the Ordre chronologique des duels d'accords. And in this particular one, we start to see how, this is a French order, by the way. This is what the French would have worn to court, and the British interpreted this. So we're not yet at a point where this is what people would have to do on a daily basis. It's not true. Because all we have to do is see something like this. It's our first mourning period, our second mourning period, our ordinary mourning period, and our half mourning period. In 1765. Brother or sister, 6 weeks, 1 day. First mourning period in wool, 3 weeks of black wool. Our second mourning period, 15 days in black silk. And our half mourning period, 6 weeks, black and white with diamonds. So, I don't know how a lower class can afford diamonds for that particular time. This was a prescription for the French and British courts. It isn't what people did on a daily basis. And I just want to dispel that people who had to wear their different periods of mourning, this completely changed in 1818, by the way, by the Lord Chamberlain, which is what Queen Victoria followed. This is a prescription. Because you might be living in a community with Jewish people over there, Catholic people over there. You might not have that much money. You cannot do this. The most you could do is honour it by wearing a bit of black. Maybe. Because you can't dye a dress, that's expensive. So what can you do? Elements of, maybe. Maybe you just wear a token of them for the rest of your life because you love them. It's not like you were automatically locked in to become that. It wasn't until the 19th century when it was just over the top and popular and cheap. It wasn't cheap yet. So, forget the 3 stages to be what people had to do. It's not true. Then we see pieces like this take over. And people started to become part of their own symbolism, an allegory. So we've got a piece like this where she is a representation of our ideal of emotion. We still have our little angel up there, taking the soul of bliss. And we've got our urn with our garments, our plinth, not lost but gone before. And here we have our cut rose, nipped in the bud. Life cut short, that's where it came from. However, she's wearing a Greco-Roman dress, and that's really important because this is where we've started to go back into archaeology and take out as much as we possibly understood about the Greco-Roman period and overcome the Christian Catholic period and start to infuse this in our daily life. Just a quick look at daily life too. I like to humanise this as much as I can. So we saw families in the 1530s. What we see here is the two couple on their wedding day. And we can see up here, they still use symbolism. Here it's a bird in a cage. So she hasn't yet given the man her marriage. She hasn't yet given him her virginity. She still has proprietary over that. And we see that in the daily life, the symbols took over as well, as much as possible. And you can see she hasn't offered the bird yet. She's still keeping her purity and essence together with her. And this kind of dress, our headdress, our classical interpretation with our underbust cut and our many, many folds. Notice little tassels and her armband there, and also a necklace. Were very fashionable, and a lot of those fashions came from in the 1760 to 80 period. We've got a lot of influence from France and Austria. We've got people like Brandt who are now really popularising all sorts of dress. You know, from peasant dress that was fashionable right the way through, and the English were very good at interpreting that. But it was really dipped in 1711 and 1738. This is Pompeii, as you can see, a photograph taken about 1850. And it was this classical archaeology that we found, and at that particular time we had a bit of an economic bubble in the 1720s, so that happened, but we were making so much money from our importing exporting over in England, and we were colonising rapidly, and we were getting taxes from those colonies. So we started to have the humanist period, which challenged all that previous thought, and all of the archaeology we found we wanted to get back into. So there you go, that's where we get our columns from, that's where we start to get our urns. And we represent ourselves by connecting ourselves back to early culture. And you can see this today if you go to Washington DC. You see effigies of Lincoln, you see the Senate and Capitol building look like they were built during Roman times. But the money came through in the 1920s. So we've always tried to get back into the classical days by being as close to them as possible, because that connects us back to empire times. And here we have some of the most popular symbols of this time. And these are the ones, it's during this period, where we cemented all of our understanding of symbolism and colour theory today. The 1760 onward period. It was as pop culture as it possibly got. Here we see our favourite. We've got our hands, this is it clasped, and this is it unspooled, with our burning heart. Our hands overcoming the burning heart and holding on tight. We've got our love hearts, we've got our love birds, our two doves. We've got two doves on top of two hearts with our garland underneath and our crown. And all of the elements of love that we understand today. And they still produce pieces with all of these symbols on them for the sake of that. Because that's eternal, and they still produce these. But this one here is quite early. So we saw how it sort of left off with Charles I. This one here is from about 1775. But they still produce pieces like it today. However, the heart shape as well, it did change and morph. This piece here, as you can see, looks kind of ovalish, but it actually still represents the heart. It's just the Rococo designs here which get integrated with it. But what we see inside the heart with faceted crystal is our urn and our willow. So we start to use the heart for our purpose of death, and it also changes the design of the heart. This is the reverse of it. You could put hair or a sentimental object back there, but most likely hair. Willow, urn, heart. And then we see our symbols start to propagate. So instead of our skulls and crossbones, we start showing pieces like this. I love this one. It's English and French. It says, "The rose withers, the butterfly flies away, and I snapped it, it fell to the ground." Snapped rose, butterfly, new life flies away. English, French. And who can see the other hidden symbol in this particular one? Thank you. There he is there. Eating his tail. I love that one. I always miss that one myself. But we've got every element there that represents what's beautiful at the same time. And that's where our death started becoming a bit more beautiful as it went along. But how did that react to other cultures? So I mentioned that, yes, there was a dissolution of the monasteries. Yes, things like Catholic icons, reliquaries, rosary beads were banned. They still existed. But people still were Catholic. You can't get rid of someone's religion. So a lot of these adaptations actually happened, and this particular piece with our skull and crossbones, our plinth, our tempus fugit, and our willow were combined together. Now, some people have attributed this to be a not correct piece, but actually I think it speaks to the values of the person. I've handled this ring several times. And this one here is from 1780 for Anne Stanway. But how does that not represent the values of the family? I don't see the urn there, and I see a symbol that would have been popular maybe only 30 years previous to this was made. So just because something changed in pop culture didn't mean it changed everywhere. Okay, that's really important. There are always anachronisms. Because no one flips a switch and turns off design. Who here owns a piece of fashion from 20 years ago? You see my videos where I'm wearing the same outfit. Or we see something that's a bit more challenging, especially during the 1760 to 1820 period. This one here is a really, really challenging one. We've got Our Lady here, and her breast is exposed. We've got our little angel here, and our two little lovebirds there. And we've got Death there, and he's taking from her a heart with an arrow through it. Okay, and he obviously has an arrow there. So it says, I alone can heal. So she's offering the soul of her loved one and her love back to death. So I alone can heal. She is representing herself as a broken relationship, and we can assume that he's passed away. But that's why death still hung around. So he's an anachronism, yes, but he's still around. But that's pretty much how we understand our representation of neoclassical jewels through our own, which were pop culture for the time. You might see this particular style. Now these were made in mass production, and these travelling miniaturists would go around from house to house, and the name could be altered, or the sentiment could be altered. Because we have many, many references of these being produced up into the hundreds for one family. Not even that far before this was made, actually. Now 1770s and 1790s, very disruptive. The storming of the Bastille in 1789. 1776, something happened somewhere. July 4th, something. You turned the boats away from the convicts from England, so where did they go? Here I am. Watch your wallets and bags on the way out, please. Trust a convict. Or it goes to the royalty. So this particular one encrusted with diamonds just shows how important it was as a symbol with its black enamel. This one here for Mary Viscountess of Andover from 1803. Or the willow could overtake. Very typical for the willow to be on its own, but you start to see the integration of hair for these particular pieces. We'll get into that in a minute, why hair was cheap. You might see the urn completely take over. Or we see an allegorical representation. And this particular one is very common down in Europe because you've got fashionable people rowing a boat. We've got a river here. Now it's had a relationship to Cajon, or the ferryman for the river Styx. But we have our urn, our plinth, our cypress, our building back there. It's not exactly a church, and we've got our classical ruins here. But these people are contemporary. It's not allegorical. It's almost like a snapshot of their lifestyle. Or we've got pieces that do have our Christian value right there at that churchyard. And this would not be uncommon if you were to wear it over in Catholic areas, because it's not challenging any sort of religious thought. It's basically a portrait for its time. Cypress, urn, plinth, church, cemetery. It's there. Not lost but gone before. It's simple, it's not challenging, and it would relate to anyone who wasn't exactly from a Protestant background. I lived in Germany for a while, and they were quite typical. Or you might see something, once again, a bit more literal. This is German. We've got our little eternal flame, we've got our temple/mausoleum, and it's all there. There's nothing challenging. It's not too allegorical. Or, once again, we get challenged by, we've got an elephant, a pelican, a lady. Alright, Hayden, alright. What does it mean? Okay. Now, the lady's holding the pelican, and the pelican was introduced by Elizabeth I. Okay, so to get it right, it's a symbol of maternity. Maternity, so she might very well have children. And with the trunk up means fortune and good luck for the elephant. So good luck in your marriage and your children. Yes?
Is this pulled off of the pelican pie?
Yes. Yeah.
What was the pelican?
So
it's the elephant's mom.
No. They're clearly just for their individual. So I can keep mixing and matching symbols for it. There's some birds in there. Yeah. This one here, the Tree of Life. This is embroidered hair, connecting the heaven with the underworld. but it's very popular during the 1770 period to 1780 period. Just the way it's woven, I just think is lovely, but also it's the tree of life. It's another popular symbol. Little Giardanetti rings, 1730 to 1760. This is where we start to see flowers become popular, and flowers start to become the little tokens that we could give as little gifts in jewellery. Very popular throughout Europe and also in England, but we start to see all the little different symbols. So we've got here, we've got tulips and roses in our little vase. Here, our tulip with a love line in white enamel, and this is actually a loving one. It's a declaration of love by the tulip. The heart is what it is, love, and the garnets mean truth. And the sentiment here is French, but it says sweet and sincere. So one of those things that you look at is sentimental, not death. But then there's something like that. And the only real obvious element here that could be mourning are the drooping flowers that are dying off. And it is a mourning piece. So this was actually dedicated for 2 people. It says, "Cease thy tears, religion points on high," is its sentiment. And the 2 people passed away in 1787 and 1782. They're also beautiful. However, it's always the woman. The woman is the representation of love and grief. So her pointing towards the heavens, and there's her hope that we saw earlier. You'll see this very, very commonly in very high quality pieces like this one for Sarah Horner, who passed away in 1796, or in very cheap pieces that were painted on, say, on paper with watercolour. Or we've got, so many symbols, so many symbols. The dead shall live and the living die. Now we've got Our Lady pointing towards a tomb, we've got a lion under there, we've got garlands being draped on the plinth by a little cherub. So once again, this is painted on ivory in its original box and with a think death. But what about that? That's a ticket for Handel's The Messiah. It was incredibly popular. People would copy these designs and they would wear them because they were popular culture. Sometimes a cigar is just a cigar. It only applies so much of our modernity to it. When you start to look into what was popular culture, which I love to do, I'm a big nerd for the 1780s, you start to see all of these things pop out. And then you go, oh, just like this one. So Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, which we'll hear of in a little bit, wrote a book in 1774, and The Sorrows of Young Werther. It was about a young man who committed suicide, and this is Charles at the tomb of Werther. So what they used to do is the pretty young things, they would go down dressed like her, down to a cemetery, and they would read the book, and they would hang out at the cemetery looking just like that. So like proto-goth, I think you could call it. So popular it was that even Napoleon I actually carried a copy of it with him everywhere. It was just a really popular book. And then you start to see jewels like that. So it's actually a dog here for fidelity, but this is actually this beautiful piece of jasper work attributed to Charlotte at the tomb of Werther. It's popular culture. So I look at that with modernity and say, well, it's clearly death. But unfortunately, if you go back through your records and you find out why it was commissioned and made, it's Charlotte at the tomb of Werther. It's pop culture. So, this is where we start to see people design themselves into their own symbols. This is a gentleman wearing his wig, his frock coat, his breeches and his pantaloons, and these are how his children were dressed. So this is an allegorical, the statement that he's in is allegorical, but the thing is they started to design themselves as people in the jewellery. So the gentlemen especially are the ones who represented themselves, and it's almost like a miniature portrait. Harder to find, but also women did it too. There you can see her with her black band on and the 2 children in their morning costume. White with a black sash is very typical, and always was typical right through to about the 1830s. Once again, that's not the Greco-Roman female, that's her. So this is towards her parents actually. It's a loving sentiment for her parents. They have our little cherubs anointing the urn with the remains with a crown. She loved them that much. We obviously have our little river here and our little town and village. Could be connotations towards the river Styx, but it's just a beautiful sentiment. And we've got our cypress and our willow. But of course, looking at these things, if it wasn't for this border, that's the loving sentiment. I could actually wear that and it would be something I would give to my loved one because it's just a betrothal piece, or it's just a piece for a sweetheart. The column's unbroken, it's got its garlands, it's representing faith and positivity and new life and eternity. We've got our two lovebirds, we've got our angel anointing that relationship with a wreath. It's as good as it gets. However, it's been reappropriated for death. Someone here passed away. And on the reverse, we actually have the name and date of death. So just because a jewel is one thing, didn't mean it couldn't be used for another thing. It could have happened in the space of a lifetime. It's very typical for children to reappropriate jewels as well. Someone's passed away at one stage, 10 years later, they've written another name into it. 10 years later, they've written another name into it. You just need to know your symbols. And there it is, as good as it gets with neoclassical period. We've got our beautifully designed child going off into the heavens, the British school piece, and the angel waiting for the child. We've got this all in three-dimensional ivory, in different discs and shapes. Resurgam, resurrection. We've got a cypress, and our willow is actually painted on the back of the glass. The piece itself is about that big, it's quite large. And it's done in colour as well. So it's a beautiful, beautiful thing, but neoclassicism really hit a point. And this particular point at the turn of the 19th century is where everything dropped away. And we'll get into that in a second. First, I'm going to do a brief segue into 1790 and 1860 colour theory and flora, fauna, and the world around us. Red. Hair, red, passion. Simple. By the way, following along. Green. Fertility, new life, rebirth. You can see it here. And here I mention Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, and Sir Isaac Newton actually tried to classify a lot of the emotional spectrum of colour. But von Goethe created the colour wheel like this. And what he did was started to break down people's reactions to emotions through the colour gradients and then classify that. And so he published in 1810 and also 1840, and this became a very popular tool to classify the emotional spectrum. But as it developed, it went into this particular one, which shows the allegorical, symbolic, and mystical use of colour. So it breaks it down that way. What are these colours? What are they for? What are their magic properties? And at the time this was made, something happened in 1794. We had the French Terror. So a lot of the upper class aristocracy, their houses were broken into, the gold was taken, the jewels were smashed. The gems flooded the market. They're cheap. But the gold went to the war effort. So the more that this was turning into a colour theory, gems represent colour. So they could be used in ways like this. Blacks, names, colours of shades, animal, vegetable, mineral. And this one here is from Abraham Gottlieb Werner, contemporary, and used a lot of what von Goethe was doing to keep expounding on it. And the more we had animals to classify shows that we were colonising more and we were reaching out across the planet. So the more the British Empire, or at least the Europeans, started to classify things, the more they became ingrained in our popular culture and our knowledge. And that's why when you go out into the cemetery, you'll see a lot of these meanings and relationships start to occur, because it was the start of the 19th century and they started to classify. Here's our blues, our purples, and our greens. And you'll see this in all of the jewellery. And also, we've got Anna Christenberg's book from 1856, The Details of Floriography. This one here is from the 1870s, The Language of Flowers. So this wasn't a new invention. Henry Phillips' Floral Emblems was published in 1825. Frederick Schoebel's The Language of Flowers with Illustrated Poetry was 1834. And you start to see how the word meant the thing. So the name of the flower meant the thing. I actually carry around with me a little miniature version of this, it's really handy. And there it is in action. So at the time this particular piece was made, there's your forget-me-not, R-E-G-A-R-D. Ruby, emerald, garnet, amethyst, ruby, diamond. Regard, acrostic. See? And that's because of our colour wheel and our colour theory. Those colours mean things from what they are. That's why at this particular turn of that 19th century period, so about 1800 to about 1830, this gold is beaten thin. It looks big, but it's thin. The gems are cheap. Gold is hard to come by. So you see this thing called canetille work where they started to make wire and it became more bulbous and voluminous. And so these pieces look bigger than they actually are. This one here is just beaten thin. You see acanthus and all of the symbolism's there. If you see these pieces and they're made out of paste, that's totally fine. The paste is glass with a foiled back. And what happens there is that the symbolism is just as relevant. So if you see an earlier piece, it's still relevant. Like this piece here, we've got our turquoise for our forget-me-nots, our flowers, and there we have hair on the back. Hair's cheap. So at the turn of the 19th century, hair starts to become more and more popular. And those big ones we saw before start to disappear. Here we have one that's been considered for mourning purpose. It's a mulberry. And the mulberry means I will not survive you. And it's in a garnet. So acceptable for third stage mourning. But is it? Possibly not. But it does have its connotation through floriography, which wouldn't previously have been classified. It's just pretty. And there you can see it with our roses and acanthus and our Gothic revival pieces. And of course, this piece here belongs to Queen Victoria. Our forget-me-nots become one of the most popular symbols of the 19th century, just through flowers and colour identification. Or our serpents. Looked at serpents before. There it is from another angle. So Queen Victoria was actually given a gift as an engagement present of a full set of serpent jewellery with diamonds and emeralds. And it's classified now, so we can use it quite liberally. And the Victorians definitely did, because she did. There it is a bit previously there, in our Ouroboros. Now, I just want to break down this one nice and quick. It's a French piece, possibly related to Creuset, the maker, designer. But what we see here are the perfect representations of 19th century symbols. There's a little fleur-de-lis. The French cannot do anything without a fleur-de-lis. Bless them. Up here we have a cross. Now, we started with this one, faith.
Are they bracelet or necklace?
It's a bracelet. The name of the person, possibly. And the star. So, the star essentially, 1834. If anyone can remember the 1980s, a certain comet went through the sky. 1834, there was a sighting of Halley's Comet. It was a huge phenomenon. There's jewels that represent it from the time there. And they still make them today. If you see a little gem, a little spray coming off of it in gold or other material, that's for Halley's Comet back in the 1830s. However, we see this all the time in our 19th century jewels, right? Actually has its roots here. Now, they call this Mauresque. This one is by Creuset from about 1861. And the English laughed it up, they loved it. And the English design and the French design was especially influenced by the Middle East. So jewels like this, a crescent, a star, and stars hanging off of it, influenced a lot of the pieces that we see. And it's all Middle Eastern. So we can see that here. There it is. If anyone's seen those gypsy set rings and lockets like this, very much has a Middle Eastern influence. And that actually is a very cultural thing for the later 19th century, for the English especially. Victoria in 1776 was crowned the Empress of India, a place or an empire where the sun never set. So now, the more we used our Middle Eastern styles, which became part of what we know as Victorian styles, it's all there. This one here is from 1874. And it's in the Royal Collection actually, for His Honour Albert Edward, Queen Victoria's son. There's 4 children's hair, and there's a little crest flower. It's beautiful. Now, mortuary tablets. So, we always represent the 19th century with things like that. Because bold black enamel, these particular pieces did not change. There's another piece like it, and imagine walking around with this at your neck. Okay? These alloys, so 1854 there was a hallmarking act, and pieces like this became bigger and bigger. We had the crinoline during the 60s, and during the 70s the bustle, 1870s. So the jewels still remain quite large, but you've got giant, that's why they call them mortuary tablets, in memory of signs at your neck. So if you're talking to family members, your friends, it's quite clear what you're in. So Queen Victoria popularised this post-1861. Pieces like this exist. As my brother, and believe it or not, in memory of 1870s, and it didn't change. So it just adapted. These rings were cheap, pieces were cheap because they're alloys, and even those of gold were quite cheap, usually about 30 shillings. But of course, in memory of, starts balancing with other different designs. Here, we've got our garter again, and there. I'm sure you can find one of these just by throwing a stone. There might even be one in the back. And there. Eternity in memory of eternal sadness. But there was also a classical revival in the 1870s, and we see here the Greek keys. So the in memory of style, heavy bold enamel, still overtakes that beautiful opulent neoclassical style that we saw only 100 years earlier, and it's still set in a very 19th century way. But what about this little fellow? He still existed. He didn't go anywhere. The skull and crossbones got appropriated right through time, in a very ugly time in the 1930s. But this piece here has been attributed to Napoleon I a bit earlier. But Parisian society, thinkers, philosophers, poets, they used to appropriate this particular design. You might see it in the catacombs over in France. They like to be surrounded by objects of mortality. It's actually a beautiful piece like this. If you send an electrical current up the stick pin, the jaw goes up and down like that. So cool. But there are things like this. These are the ones that always remain. So it was because these were so consistent through the 1861 to 1901 period that people got a bit bored, and the design started to become pretty stagnant, and it just stayed the same for such a long time. So fashion didn't adapt like it did only 100 years ago. So the symbolism just became what's basic elements here, just like the hair. So, yeah, I've only got 34 minutes left, so, sorry, 24 minutes. You might have seen, so lower grade alloys led to things like this, souvenir pieces. This is part one, about, it's a Genesis quote from Genesis 31 to 49 to 50. So when two people are apart, you say mispar, it's supposed to represent the distance between two people. But you'll see these everywhere because they were cheap, because they could be made out of lower grade alloys and sold as little love tokens. And alloys are great. People, like pinchbeck is an alloy, usually an adulteration of different materials, but they could become bigger and adapt, and you could create larger jewels and lighter jewels. And it could create jewels that would balance around different things like photography, because you could produce them quickly and cheaply. And also we've started to look at our jet. Jet was really popular, so black jewels as they were called, the dark jewels, these ones were popular. This one here holds a yew sprig for sorrow. So yes, okay, you can say that's sad, but they would hold any number of things, cards, you name it. And they were just popular souvenirs given out that were cheap. See our Whitby jet, our gold standard of jet? As an industry, it grew. So from 1832, it had 2 shops and 25 people in Whitby, the town of Whitby. And in 1870, 200 shops, employing 1,500 men, women and children. Just because Queen Victoria popularised a lot of this design. Is it death? No. Are some? Absolutely. It's just popular because that was the design people wore. The designs people wore. We chiefs, and our crucifix there. But we also see things like vulcanite and gutta percha. Vulcanite is an early rubber, popularised by Goodyear. I'm sure some of you drove here. Same thing. That was in 1846. A mix of rubber and sulphur, sometimes known as ebonite, and it sort of goes a bit green after a while. But they can press it and mould it. It's a plastic, so essentially they can make all sorts of designs. We've got grapes here. So they could be anything. But is it death? Bog oak, Irish? No, they're just popular in Ireland. They're just designs that were used. It's a material that was used, just like this one, French jet. Glass. Otherwise known because, well, I'm from the British Empire, thank you very much, so I like to call it Vauxhall glass, thank you. French jet. But popular right through the 20s and 40s, 1920s, 1940s. Is it death? No. It's just fashionable. Or this beautiful one here, some of you may know it, this is onyx. And that's Mary Todd Lincoln's Mourning watch. And that is a scarf pin in gold, deifying Abraham Lincoln in a very similar pose to that of a Roman emperor. So we start to see all these elements come through, but this most popular one, of course, was hair. So hair itself, Bernard & Co. of New York here, was cheap. So all of the more materials that there were, the cheaper things got. And that way it could reach a larger audience faster. So here we can see the crucifix and actually the photograph of the lady wearing the crucifix. Beautiful and stunning, but they're cheap. And because it is the most abundant material, it can be woven into all sorts of things and used in daily life, just like this with watch chains. It can adapt to photography. It can be used to combine different family hairs together for a certain moment. It's not about death, it's because people could weave it, and it would be used liberally, and obviously quite cheaply. This would be worn thusly, with a watch chain. So you've got your watch on one end, you've got your key on the other, and you've got your different charms on that. And of course it went to the upper echelons too. This one here is possibly by James Turner in England, and a very, very fine piece this is. So it did go from the very expensive to the very cheap. Now, on that note of being cheap and materials, let's have a quick look at profit and loss. Who were these people? Why would they produce these jewels? We've looked at the desire behind them, the sentimental reasons why people wanted them, because they can see it all around them. People are wearing it, so they want it. So who is actually profiting from it? I like to break down the necessity. We've looked at a lot of the necessity. The cost of mourning. How much do these jewels cost? The goldsmiths, the hair artists, and the businesses. And who is actually generating profit from this? So I broke down this before, but post this I should say. So post the 1817 period, the Lord Chamberlain actually changed the mourning dates for the population to change. So the other one was for court, but it was 12 weeks of mourning for the death of the king or queen. 6 weeks for the death of the son or daughter of the sovereign, 3 weeks for the monarch's brother or sister, 2 weeks for royal nephews, uncles, nieces or aunts, 10 days for the first cousins of the royal family, and foreign sovereigns mourned for 3 weeks. So that would limit the production, the time that people went into mourning, and at this time we had the Industrial Revolution. So items that could be worn were cheap. You could wear an armband because it was produced cheaply. So a gentleman could do that for a 6-week period, which they did. But this year is somewhat antiquated, it's still worn in court. But we don't carry things like our silver buckles and sword around with us, I don't think so. And of course for a husband, a woman has to be in her first stage, the entire stage is for 1 year and 6 weeks. And of course if a wife dies, 6 months for a guy. But it's all about these things. Our catalogues and the books of fashion plates that people would show off. This is a lady in fashionable mourning going to a dinner party as a child. She's dressed in high fashion. This is from about 1809. So we saw before how people dressed, and she's going out to dinner. Look at her gloves, she's beautiful. She's even got a beautiful white neck around there. We've got a drapery here with a scarf. We've got her white gloves, and she's got a little bonnet on. We've got here the lady, once again, another dinner dress, a little bit later. But also the ideal, you could change out your mourning dress quite frequently. You could adapt your dress to new tastes and fashion. Just because you're in those mourning periods doesn't mean you couldn't look good. But her, is she dainty? She's lovely. And remember, people are reading these and getting these in their hands very, very quickly. At times when they were mass-produced by steam presses. So you could actually have these quite frequently on a weekly basis, on a monthly basis, on a seasonal basis. And then you see the fashion that started to cultivate, especially post-1861, where the design of yourself into a mourning scenario through a photograph was quite eloquent and beautiful. And you can see here, she's dressed in all her finery. This is from about second stage mourning, she's got reflective surfaces. And here, you notice that other plate before? She's gorgeous, she's dressed in high fashion. So it's all there. All we see is half mourning dress. It dates from about 1889 to 1892, French. But look at the lace, look at the detail. If that's not beautiful, I don't know what is. So ladies at the time, those that could afford it, wanted to purchase it. And who were the ones exploiting that? That's what I wanted to find out. So I broke down a list. These are the mourning warehouses. They would outfit your entire lifestyle for the sake of mourning through the designs of fashion, crepe, fans, you name it. And I've got them broken down, and we've got a few. Alexander Monroe's Mourning Warehouse is one. Peter Robinson's Mourning Warehouse is another. They also called him Black Peter Robinson because all he had was crepe, black crepe everywhere. He had a lot of money. We've got Jay's, the London General Mourning Warehouse, which is probably one of the most well-known. We've got Sangster and Henderson's General Mourning Warehouse in Aberdeen. And we've got the Nottingham General Mourning Warehouse in Nottingham, of course. So they were advertising furiously for people's money. Look at this one. Messrs. J would respectfully announce that great economy is affected by purchasing mourning at their establishment, 247 Regent Street, London. Their stock of family mourning being the largest in Europe. Though Messrs. J professedly keep the best articles for mourning and half mourning, they supply a complete suit of domestic mourning for 2.5 guineas. Quite cheap. Mourning costume of every description is kept ready-made and can be forwarded to town or country. So they advertise the hell out of these things. And there's Peter Robertson's rebuttal. He has his own in-house dressmaker. He would send to your house with a catalogue, and you could pick out the fashions and the designs that you wanted to. And then at a moment's notice, they would whip up the costume for you and send it over to you. And he also combined his business with the Navy and wanted to try and see which one would win. So who's actually going to generate the most money from Hayden Peters? That one won. So mourning overtook the military in many ways. And continue they did. Over a period during the 1850s, he advertised the hell out of it. But after the 1850s, he became the premier one. How do we know? We still have plenty of examples of his work. That's how he used to sell it. And that there is a bolt of his grave. And of course, they would advertise against each other. Peter versus Jay. Pick out advertisements. But of course, Jays would always sell that by appointment to the Queen. So how can you beat that, Peter Robertson? Then they would talk about how cheap they all were. But they always broke it down. So you could actually dye your dress black. Indigo black in different colours. We saw colour theory break down. So indigo silks at 45 shillings, plain dresses at 6 shillings, trimmed 8 shillings, and elaborate at 10 shillings. So reasonably cheap for these people. And of course it went so far out as Scotland. So that these mourning warehouses had such a demand they had to satisfy them. They would be everywhere across the UK. They were over here in America, they were over in Australia. Wherever you could order them from. And then you start to see all the different ways that they would sell. At the mourning warehouse, at the mourning warehouse, mourning mansions at the mourning warehouse. They had repetition. It's no different than turning on the TV today and looking at one of these commercials. They're all the same. And then you can see someone like Alexander Munro. This is an entire broadsheet of a newspaper. This one here dates from 1883. Munro's Mourning Warehouse, Munro's Mourning Warehouse, Munro's Mourning Warehouse. Incredible. Like the money is to try and get your cash, because remember, you're in grief and you look at this and you want to go there and buy something. So is it the businesses maybe, but also the goldsmiths. I just want to have a quick zoom and look at these fellows here. I took out some of my jewels and I really wanted to know who actually did this. I know who they're for, that's fine, but every time you wear a ring and you see a hallmark, it gets lost a little bit because it wears down. So who are the ones who made these things? And the breakdown is actually quite cheap. And your memory of ring costs 18 to 40 shillings. A gentleman's mourning ring, it's quite expensive with diamonds, 80 to 210 shillings, but went as low as 30 shillings. And we've got here about 24 to 70 shillings for a basic brooch. And this is 1850s money. Now, this is a bit later, but the mourning rings that were made during the 1600s were £1 each. Okay, £1. Now, the money that a family had, a regular sized family, for a year's income, £50. Now, £1 for a ring. We've got examples from Robert Walpole and also Samuel Pepys that show that they were giving out up to 123 rings for a funeral. They gave them to you at the door as you came in. So a family of pretty good wealth, so they called them a middling class, back in the 1680s, was getting about £200, and about £16 of that was discretionary spending, and yet they're still giving out rings of £1. Those middling class people had servants. How are they affording this? I won't make you read all this, it's quite in depth, but this is the will of Colonel Sir Edward Stock. Now, at the time, he gave out rings for his captains of ships at £10 each, the foreman, £20, John Hancock, £50, Thomas Hooper, £100 each, and his nephews, £100 each. It's all there in his will. £100 each at a time where we looked at shillings, and where these people aren't making that much money. But he was also a sir and a colonel. But that's an incredible amount of money for its time. It's the same as the 1680s. £1 for a ring is an incredible amount of money. But I looked at my first ring. This is from Mary Ann Lewis, 1853. I turned it around. I know who she is. I've done my research on her. That's fine. And I had the sister ring too. 15 years later, it found me, out of the blue. A seller in London, hadn't spoken to her in 6 months. She said, "Oh, hey, you like Buckingham pieces, what do you think?" Marianne Mills, 1853. So I had the sister ring made. There it is. But who made it? Who was the one? And they're gone, mostly gone, through age and wear. But I found that one there. It's WR, and these are hallmarks. So I broke out Jackson's hallmarks. If you haven't got it, I hope that you do. It's actually a facsimile of a facsimile of a facsimile, so it's not perfect. You can't get everything in it. The assay office is over in London and Edinburgh, Birmingham. They have the records of who the people were that made these things. But in terms of this book, it's fallible. But I had another ring I went back through, CSC, and we've got all these stamps up here, which is pretty crisp. We've got our duty mark there. We've got our gold mark there. Here, we've got our year it was made. So what they used to do is they used to break it down from the alphabet and then assign every letter to a year. So you can find out when these rings were made pretty easily. And of course our maker's mark. So I couldn't exactly find out who this was. I found a few, they all look the same. Not all look the same, but there could be someone with a cartouche that's identical to this one, who's from Aberdeen and another one from Birmingham. So I looked at some other rings. This one's for James Chafee Esquire, and he passed away in 1802. And I've got this one up here, MG. And then I did my looking around, and I've got this one for Sir Stephen Lushington. Now, has anyone heard of the East India Company? So he was the chairman of the East India Company for most of the latter 18th century. Now, 22 karat gold, 22 karat gold. At a time during the Napoleonic Wars were about to be. Okay, and you can see his design style for MG. It's quite bold, geometric, very popular for the time. But he, during the turn of the 19th century, was doing it quite often. But here's Stephen Lushington's ring. So, quite influential person. And of course, there we are, MG. Interesting. And this one here for Benjamin Denman, MG. Seen better days, this would have had the enamel in it, but you can see the design style is identical. Just for an example, here's what these rings should look like at the time. Notice the giant open weave over here, the shoulders. It's making more with less, we don't have the gold. The gold itself has a bit of rose tint to it, it's got zinc. We don't have 22 karat gold, we have plentiful here. Also, paste here. Makes it look larger on prongs. It's making the jewel look bigger, we don't have enough gold. And of course, there's something missing in that one, isn't there? The rank is gone. It's cheap, it's painted quickly, it's on paper, and the gold itself is adulterated. So at a time of war, this could be given to a sweetheart and made quickly. So why is this there and MG's there? So I did my research and I found out his name is Matthew Gobert. So who was Matthew Gobert? Well, he lived right there in London, in Ironmonger Row. So in 1871, he studied under James Richards, a goldsmith and watch case maker. 1800 to 1812, he moved here. And in there, he lived with 3 apprentices, his wife and his kids. In 1818, he took an apprentice, Joseph Potter, and in 1823, he passed away there. So he made mourning rings of the highest quality at 22 karat gold. Up there. So essentially what happened is, in 1812, he was actually robbed by one of his apprentices, Charles Packer. Sorry, Charles Williams, and Packer was another apprentice. So Charles Williams actually stole 24 watch cases and 80 ounces of silver, and it amounted to about £80 for the time. And this poor guy's living in one room. I have the account of it, I won't read it out here, please. It's in my book, actually, Profit and Loss. It's actually quite a sad tale where I went through records at the Old Bailey, and I found a really harrowing account of him having to go up in the dock and state what happened on the night he was actually robbed by his own apprentice, who they caught, but he actually got away with it. So, Gobert didn't die with wealth, and he didn't leave behind a legacy that we know of. It actually took a lot of work to try and find out just who he was, basically. And yet we see pieces like this. That's Tiffany & Co., 1868. Now, I was over at the Met and I saw this, I was there with the curator, and why is Tiffany & Co. still existing? At a time when someone like Gobert isn't. And how come they're so popular? Why was it there were pieces like this made? So Augustus Northmore Welby Pugin, designed this piece, and his Catholic influence is all over Gothic cathedrals and the Gothic revival style, which lasted well into what Victoria took ahead of her. If you've seen those big black jewels, like I said, more details, and he was a designer to influence in society. Okay, this one here, John Hardman actually made in Birmingham, and it's of the highest quality, and so much so that it was influencing people like William IV, and that's his mourning ring there. And of course, if you're a collector, you've seen that all over the place. And that's because of people who were like Pugin designing popular fashion. But Gobert didn't last. You can see that there. We've all seen pieces like that. Yeah, Gobert died lonely. I'm sure he was rich and wealthy with his personal life, but he died with his apprentices and his family. And he didn't create the generation of money and name for himself that the others did. So maybe it wasn't him that created profit from those. Now, hair artists. Hair artists are everywhere. Now we've got Schuff, Fourier, Cleal, Baconwell, Benjamin Lee, who was in the Great Exhibition of 1851, Tyzack and Milne. And that's where they lived and worked right there. All that wonderful, wonderful competition between them all. This is a breakdown of how much these things costed. So hair bracelets for about 5 shillings and hairpins for about 15 shillings. About half the price of a gold piece. So they were cheap, cheap, cheap. And they advertised against each other, this G. Hooper here, and this fellow here, Judeni, who'd always snipe at people in newspapers. If someone rented out some space, he would go right underneath them and basically say that his stuff is even better, which I love. It's just so sneaky. But they fought against each other, and they used their own brands as their names, and vice versa, because they were. This one here, I won't read it all out, but it does say that every precaution is taken that actual hair scent is used, and only 4 ounces of hair is enough to create a bracelet, chain, or albert. 4 ounces of hair can create a chain that big. They talked about how their fashion and style was the best from the continent. So they would travel, they would take it back, and they would show off that their stuff was more opulent and elegant, and it was better because they lived in France. And everything that you ever gave them in terms of your loved one's hair wasn't really colour matched at all by a nun, and because that's what they used to do, the nuns would grow their hair very long, chop it off and sell it. By the time this was produced, about 50 tonnes a year was being imported into England. And the hair artists would match the colour. Yeah, we'll probably use that for stuffing or fusing, and we'll just weave the hair into something that's a beautiful chain that's only 4 ounces of your loved one's hair. So they find each other consistently. And this one here from the 1830s, 1839, shows that hair jewellery was becoming as popular as wedding jewellery. But I want to focus on this person here, Antony Fourier. So a Swiss fellow, a jeweller from Winterthur. He used his brand quite a lot, and he's one of the most notorious hair artists there was, because we have so many references to his pieces. Here's where he worked, okay? This one here, this is Regent Street, Piccadilly, and he had a shop right here. And here's a piece of his work here for Sarah Sparks, and that he always used the Queen's coronet. He was in appointment to the Queen, so he advertised all the time. You can see just how identifiable his designs are here. There again, by appointment to the Queen. And once again, another piece of his. And Fourier used his brand over and over again. He lasted a very long time. He lasted until about 1889 and passed away at the age of 89. And we can see his pieces in the Royal Collection. Yet at this time, he actually had a bit of a problem. He sold his brand to the business of Charles Packer, and Charles Packer is just like your modern Masons. They had a department store, jewellery department in 136, Foreign and Fancy, and Jet and Mourning at 76 Regent Street. They were a department store. And Fourier sold his brand to Packer and then took it back. And for about 2 years, Charles Packer, the company, it's like Macy's saying that they've got appointment to the Queen, which you like to do, or they like to do. But Fourier would have to take out advertisements saying, no, Antony Fourier has no connection whatsoever with his late establishment at 136 Regent Street here. So they were using their brand a lot. But of course, that sneaky little Judeni, he had to start getting to sell stuff better anyway, so forget those two. So these people weren't making a great ton of money, and they were still dying well off, but not great. So we need to focus on a bit of the businesses as we wrap it up in almost. So these businesses, this one here by John Brogman, designed a lot of the popular jewels of the time. But these were used in catalogues. They're very famous in the V&A Museum. And we've seen actually this particular one just earlier on. These were the basic fundamental designs that they used. So something like this is quite well known. But there's a guy who lived here. His name is Alfred Schuff. And as a hair artist, he tried to start his own business, just like Fourier. But he produced pieces like this. And we saw this before. You saw it in situ on a lady. And they're nothing special. And unfortunately, Schuff didn't exist as a business for much longer. He went into liquidation right there. And it's quite sad, really. He actually tried to get money back for a little while, but in the end his business dissolved and he died quite penniless. So when I was following this through, I'm noticing the hair workers aren't making that much money. But people like this are. And that's Samuel Courtauld. He's a charming fellow. He took over the business from his dad George. And essentially, he turned it into a business that still exists today. And what did he make his money on? Black crepe. Lots and lots of it. So he was actually American, born in Albany, New York, 1793. His dad started as a silk weaver in 1775, but he took it over in 1816 during the Industrial Revolution. And he did things like promote the use of children being used in places like this. So the Industrial Revolution, he really fought hard. Now, like I said, the business still exists today, creating fabrics and also chemicals. So when he died, he was worth about £700,000 in 1880s money. That's insane, considering the gross domestic product was about £100,000. So what he did do in the span of 50 years was turn over the business's capital growth from £40,000 to £450,000, which is a 1,025% increase in business. So clearly we have someone who's exploiting the whole brief situation. We've got people advertising it in their morning warehouses, and he's supplying it all over the world, really. But over here, just as a last little aside, so we have Jay's General Mourning Warehouse, the London General Mourning Warehouse. So William J. Chickall basically worked right there. Okay? So he was born in 1811, and he started as a shawl warehouse and then moved into the mourning industry, just like Black Peter did with his naval work. But he started taking over more and more space. So he had actually 247 to 249 Regent Street, and there it is. The London General Mourning Warehouse there, 247, 249. And I've just got a quick little account of what it was like to walk into his shop. This one here is from 1848. Now, this is how he marketed his own business. So Jay's presented a dazzling appearance. The street was crowded with spectators, some on foot and some in carriages, and from the splendid magazines of fashion on either side of the road there poured a flood of light which made the dead waste and middle of the night as brilliant as noonday. Gaslighting. Mr. W.C. Jay's Mourning Warehouse, number 247, was magnificently decorated with devices in gas. In the centre was displayed an imperial crown with the royal initials on either side. The group of ornaments was overarched by a circular device of unique design, and underneath were festoons knotted with shamrocks. So people could walk in for their daily morning needs. They could get fashion, and he promoted this fashion quite well. Because here we go. You could have your spring novelties at Jay's. You could dress up as you would in spring. And this one here's from March. So we've got March 1890. And the more that you dig into there, the more that he shows he's bringing all these mourning ideas and concepts into England. There's April. And there's May. So essentially you can go there for all of your mourning needs, stay in the current fashion, which has always been the latest and the greatest from all around the world. New fabrics, new everything, fans, you name it, shawls, festoons, you name it. And he marketed and monetized so much so he published his own book, Jay's of Regent Street by Richard Davey, called A History of Mourning. And so if you look at the catalogues and books that were produced by these people, they're basically propaganda. So you can essentially connect the things that you're wearing back to ancient times, because it goes back into the Egyptians and the Romans and how they dressed and what they wore. But it's a great piece of branding for someone who's going out to your house and bring with them a catalogue, they would drop the book off as well. So you've got always to refer back to Jay's, because remember, someone in your household's going to die, so who's the first person you're going to contact? So when he passed away, he was actually worth, on the 27th of April 1888, Jay was worth £100,000. So about the same money as England. He definitely promoted from profits and loss. Yet, I just want to wrap up by looking at who are the real people behind this. And these are the people whose eyes you need to look into when it comes down to the exploitation of grief, the reality of it. And this is actually in the property of Queen Victoria, but you can see here Mrs. Douglas and her children, and there's no mistaking exactly the look in their eyes. So as much as we like to talk about how people could be exploited, there's a necessity for it, and that's memory. Because without the memory and the love, and the elements of this that we can wear around us, even if it's a shirt or it's a thing that you have of someone you love, a thing that they did, a thing that they used that you keep with you to create that connection of memory, regardless of the strata or the types of people who produce these objects or this product, it doesn't matter because you love them. And it's that love which you need to keep with you as much as you possibly can. Just like I do for Mary Ann Lewis, who passed away in 1853, and because of her passing away, I'm here in front of you today to share as much of that memory as I possibly can with you. So that's why I always look back to this and I still get a bit of a tear in my eye. It's an emotional thing for me, as it was for her family, I'm sure. But we cannot overlook that there is a hell of a lot of romance and love in each and every one of these pieces. So on that note, I want you also to go home and look out around you and notice the symbolism that's around you. See how it connects to our history, the people we were, the families that we have, where we came from. And please create some new memories. Reach out to friends and family and create new friends and relationships around you. Share some of the love and stories that you have of people that you don't have with you in your life anymore. Because remember, if you share their memory, they're never ever gone. Expounded upon Egaeuspress.com, Death and Folly. If you go to artofmourning.com, there's a link there on the homepage, second up of it, I think, and you can get a copy of it as you like. It'll do me a big favour, I love it. And there's a lot more research to go, and well, it's a bit of reading material. But thank you so much, everyone. It means so much to come back here and Miscellany and do everything, and stay with you and share as much time as I possibly can with you. I wish we had more time. I can do this all night. Thank you. Thank you.